homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. My name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm. I am making a dish I make once a year right now, and that dish is called moussaka. And it's kind of like an eggplant lasagna in some ways, but you use bechamel sauce. So it's got a white sauce that goes with it. It is super yummy. It is one of the few ways that I truly love eggplant. I'm not a giant eggplant eater. And I grew eggplant for the first time in a long time this year, and so I have quite a bit of it. Normally, I would just go to the farmer's market and buy a couple of eggplants to make this recipe. My husband is not an eggplant lover at all, and so I generally make this, and then he has to eat one meal of it because I made it, and I don't give him a lot of choice. Obviously, he could just eat something else. And then after that, I freeze it in single serving sizes, and I just put it in. I use it for lunch the rest of the year. And so I always have a freezer full of moussaka for those days when you just are under the gun and you need a good lunch and you want something yummy. So just beautiful. This is an heirloom variety of eggplant from Baker Creek, Rosa something. I always forget the name. I'll put it up on the screen. It's done well for me this year. I have 4 plants, and it was supposed to only be 2, but I either mixed up the tags or Baker Creek mixed up the seed. I'm not sure which, because the other 2 were supposed to be a Japanese eggplant. And this is what I have. So I have a lot of these. They are really lovely and creamy. You may have read in various recipes that eggplant needs to be salted and drained in order to remove bitterness. That was true quite a while ago, but most eggplants at this point have been selected to avoid that character trait. So it's actually really not all that necessary for you to salt and drain eggplant before you do anything with it. And I have not found this eggplant to be bitter at all. I also wonder if that's maybe something to do with growing conditions, because honestly, I've never eaten an eggplant that I noticed was particularly bitter. But what we're gonna do is bake off this eggplant, and that entails slicing it up into 1/2-inch slabs, and then we're just gonna put it on a cookie sheet, brush some olive oil onto it, and bake it in an oven until it is tender. Eggplant is like a sponge. It will suck up tons of oil. And so it's definitely one of those things that you can go light or you can go heavy on how much oil you put on it, just depending on your own taste and your own calorie wishes. I tend to not go super heavy. But yeah, it will take all the oil you throw at it, basically. Because I've got 2 baking sheets here, I don't really have to make these quite as tight. I might spread these out a little bit. And these are just sheet pans from a restaurant supply store, and then parchment paper. I think the original recipe calls for tinfoil, but I like parchment paper better. It's a little more sustainable. All right. So this calls for oiling both sides. What I think I'm going to do here is just drizzle, and then I'll go back in with the brush. I do like, and so you can see like how quickly that oil has just sunk into wherever it landed. Again, it's basically a big sponge. I'm not worried about it. It's gonna roast just fine. I might oil and then brush on one side before I do the other, just because it does sink in so fast. Greasy fingers. Are y'all appalled that I'm not using a dish and putting it in the dish. Sometimes I did a huge kitchen cleanup this morning. I had a friend come over. She had suggested a cooking class that was local, that was how to make your own pasta, and it was $150 a person. And I kind of laughed, and I said, you know, I can teach you how to make pasta. It's not that hard. I've had one of those hand crank Atlas pasta makers for about 30 years, and so we decided to do that instead of spend a ridiculous amount of money on a cooking class. And so she came over the other night, last night, and we made homemade pasta and then did a beautiful tomato sauce on it. And it was a great meal, but my kitchen was just destroyed. There was just flour everywhere, and it was a ton of stuff to clean up. So, so I spent a ton of time this morning cleaning up my kitchen and washing about 3,700 dishes. And I just didn't feel like washing one more greasy bowl. So, yeah, took the easy way out there. All right, so I'm just gonna sprinkle a good generous portion of kosher salt on these. I think eggplants are a little like potato in that they need some good seasoning. You've probably seen chefs do this, you know, with great shots of like from a distance doing this. The higher you drop the salt from, the more it spreads out when it lands, and so you can cover more product when you drop it from a height, which is why they do that. Plus it just looks cool. And let's face it, who doesn't want to look cool as a chef? So a little fresh ground black pepper and some salt, and we're good to go. Close enough. My oven is preheating to 475. Looks pretty good. And we are just gonna put those in there. My bad, hold on. Cover with foil. So after all that, I did not get out of not using foil. And I'm not gonna seal this terribly much. There's gonna be plenty of steam trapped in there without me having to make it super tight or do multiple sheets. I believe we're roasting for 25 minutes. I think I'll come in 10 minutes and just rotate all the trays, and we'll be back and see how it came out. All right, our timer is going off, and our eggplant should be done. Whew, a little steamy. Ooh, I forgot to turn the timer off. And we're just roasting these until tender. And so you can see how nice and soft that is. There's no resistance at all to a knife. That's what we're looking for. All right. Our eggplant is ready. All right, continuing on with our moussaka. I need for the meat sauce a small onion. This is a half a medium. This is a pretty small onion, so I'm just going to use the whole thing. A tiny bit of rot happening in the middle of that onion. Nothing that a little bit of slicing won't get rid of. 3 cloves of garlic. A little bit of schmutz on this one. This is some of my scratch and dent garlic from this year. All right, those will get minced. All right, in our skillet for our moussaka, we've got some olive oil, onion, I'm going to get just a little bit of a softening of this onion before I add our meat and our garlic. You can see my pan was probably just a little bit on the hot side, but it's cooling down and I've turned the heat down. All right, that's enough of that. And this recipe calls for ground beef. I'm actually using ground lamb, which is a little more traditional. And because we raise lamb, or at least we did, we stopped recently, I happen to have ground lamb, and I really love this recipe with lamb. So I'm just going to go ahead and make it with lamb instead. There we go. But ground beef would be perfectly fine here. And this is, you know, this is a classic saute of ground meat that is the start of 1,000 recipes. Onions, garlic, meat. I'm just going to try to get this broken up into chunks here. See what else I need to add. So one of the things that makes this recipe unique and very more Middle Eastern is the use of some baking spices in the recipe. And so we are going to add oregano, but we are also going to add allspice, a little bit, tiny bit of allspice, cloves, and a stick of cinnamon. And that is just going to permeate and flavor this in a very subtle way that is just delicious. My husband is not a big fan of baking spices in savory applications, and so I don't do this very often. But he's also not a big fan of eggplant, and so because he's not really going to be eating this most of the time, I'm just going to make it the way I like it. You know, compromise in a marriage keeps you together. We've been married for almost 25 years. But occasionally you get to indulge yourself as well. So half a teaspoon of oregano. I'm going to make that kind of a heaping half a teaspoon because half a teaspoon doesn't seem like very much. This is homegrown, home-dried oregano. So I'm just going to crumble that up. 1/8 of a teaspoon, so teeny amount of allspice. Even less of clove. This is a pinch. We're going to go with about 1/2 of a teaspoon. And then a cinnamon stick. These spice jars, you can buy these at a company that specializes in bottles. I originally bought them from Penzeys Spices, and I've since learned that other locations where I could have bought them for a whole lot less money than I spent buying them from Penzeys. What I like about them is they're big enough that I can easily get a measuring spoon into them, because I really hate it when something calls for a tablespoon of something and I can't even get 1/2 teaspoon into the container. And so I got very frustrated with that about 15 years ago and just bought a bunch of new spice jars for everything that were wide mouthed. They hold about 1/2 cup a piece, and so they're really nice for refilling things as well. But yeah, SKS Bottle also sells something very, very similar, if not the exact thing that Penzeys has. And so you can just buy, you know, a case or two of those and do your own if you want. I love the display of having spice bottles out. It's so gorgeous, but spices store way, way better if they're kept in a cool, dark place. And that means unless you need an opaque jar where the light isn't getting in, which is almost impossible to find. Oh, shoot. Or you need to keep them in a drawer or a cupboard or someplace where they're not going to be exposed to light all the time. And so, yeah, all of those gorgeous, you know, round, Lazy Susan, round tabletop spice display things that you put on your counter when you're cooking. It looks really pretty, but actually definitely not the best way to maintain the quality of your spices. I also need 1/2 teaspoon of table salt in this recipe, some fresh ground black pepper, call that about 1/4 teaspoon. My general rule of thumb is to do pepper in about half of the amount of the salt that they called for. So if it's 1/2 teaspoon of salt, I'll put 1/4 teaspoon of pepper in. And I turned my heat way, way down on this, and then the lamb was right out of the fridge, and so it was pretty cold, and so I've slowed down a lot of my browning. I've turned my heat back up just a bit. This also calls for a bay leaf.
Hi, Peabody. What are you doing, bub? Hi.
So I've been growing bay leaf for a couple of years now, and that plant lives outside in the summertime, and then it comes in. It can take a light frost, but it can't take a full winter outside, and so it comes in the wintertime, and it's really fun to just have fresh bay leaves. Okay, our lamb is looking nicely browned here. I'm going to add a bay leaf. This calls for 1.5 cups of tomato. And normally I would just slice up a fresh tomato and throw it in there in the, you know, about 12 ounces of tomato. Unfortunately, I literally don't have any fresh tomatoes right now. I just used the last of them in a different recipe that I'm making today. And so I'm going to use some of my canned tomatoes from last year. And it calls for 1.5 cups. This is more like 2 cups. I'm not going to worry about it. That water will cook down. But these are canned heirloom tomatoes from last year. They're pretty juicy. There's quite a bit of moisture in there. This is a really simple meat sauce, not terribly complicated. And moussaka just gets layered. It's like a lasagna. The hardest part is making the bechamel, which is what we're going to do next. All right, so we'll let this cook a bit and let some of that moisture come out of there, and then we'll see where we're at. All right, we're going to make our bechamel for our moussaka. And bechamel is an egg cream sauce, basically. And if you've ever looked at French cooking at all, French cooking has what they call the 5 mother sauces, and bechamel is one of them. I don't remember off the top of my head what the other 4 are. But what we're going to do is make a flour and butter cream sauce, and then we're going to incorporate eggs into it. So I'm starting out here with 5 tablespoons of butter. That was a rough estimate because my butter is soft and normally I just cut it from the stick. We're going to melt this. All right, our butter is melted. To that, we're going to add 6 tablespoons of flour. And this is basically called making a roux, where you make an emulsion of the flour and the butter. And you cook it just long enough to where it's smooth and that raw flour taste has been cooked out. There we go. See how you're starting to get bubbles on the side? That's what you're looking for there. I had to turn my heat up a little bit. Cooking out any of that raw flour flavor. All right, I'm going to turn this off, and now I'm going to add in, and this is going to bubble and steam. I'm going to, oh, not too bad. I'm going to slowly add in our milk. Initially, it's going to want to chunk up. This is 3 cups of milk. This was fridge temperature, so I just cooled everything way down. It's going to take a while to come back up to heat. Keep an eye on this. It's really easy to turn your back, waiting for it to come to temperature and boil it over, so just be aware. Keep an eye out. Turning our heat back on. And we're cooking this meat sauce for about 20 minutes until the moisture from those tomatoes has pretty much disappeared and it's thickened up a bit. So we're pretty close here. Because I'm keeping an eye on it, I'm going to let it go for another couple minutes. But that's almost there. Okay, we need 3 eggs. We need 1 whole egg. That was a good one to have be the whole one. And then we need 2 egg yolks. My favorite way to separate eggs is with my fingers. I actually think it's much easier and you're much less likely to break the yolk if you just use your hands. Don't throw out your egg whites. I have a freezer full of egg whites. It's kind of funny because so many recipes call for an extra yolk. But I save them up, and when I get to a certain point, if I'm having people over, I will make a angel food cake. And so it's a great way to use up leftover egg whites. You can also just obviously incorporate them into omelets or breakfasts and just add a little extra white to your mix, but don't throw them out. I think we're gonna turn our meat sauce off. Sure, because it's in a cast iron pan, it's going to keep evaporating. So once this bechamel comes to a boil and thickens, which is what we're doing, we made an emulsion of butter and flour, and then as that flour in there heats up, it's going to thicken this into a really lovely, just simple cream sauce. And I can feel it wanting to stick. There's a lot of sugar in dairy, so I can feel it wanting to stick on the bottom. And it's always fun. I forget what temperature it is that the actual thickening takes place, but there's like a magic temperature and suddenly it thickens. which is cool. We're getting close, I can feel it. As you get close, you want to keep stirring. This is the part where it can really easily scorch on the bottom or boil over if you're not watching it closely. You see how we're getting tiny bubbles on the edges there? That's typically about when things start to thicken. So, and this has got a nice texture to it at this point. To this, as we're waiting for it to come to a boil, quite a bit of salt, 1.5 teaspoons. And a pinch of nutmeg. And a pinch of nutmeg is really common in these kind of cream sauces. You'll see it in cream pasta sauces a lot too. And it does add, it sounds weird, but it adds a really lovely flavor. And then of course, because we have the other baking spices in our meat sauce, it actually kind of really works together. Now we're gonna bring this to a boil. Can you see how much that's thickened? That's a lot of flour. So this should be a really nice thickened sauce. All right, I think we've got a good rolling boil there. I'm gonna turn that heat off. So this cools and then we stir in the eggs. There are ways to speed that up, and I will show you one of them now. Our heat is off. I'm just going to put our eggs back into our measuring cup because it's too hard to whisk this. What we're gonna do here is temper our eggs. If we were to just dump our eggs into this sauce right now, it's way too hot and they would immediately cook. But if we take our nice cool eggs and we slowly drizzle in some of our warm sauce, it's gonna slowly warm those eggs up while diluting them. And it's going to cool off our sauce at the same time. And you can become more aggressive with it as things get more incorporated. I think my goal today is to see how many rubber spatulas I can go through. This is so thick, I hate to waste it. So now we should be able to incorporate this egg mixture back into our custard. And again, slowly. What we're avoiding here is scrambled eggs. Heat is off. But this way you don't have to sit around and wait for 20 minutes for your custard to cool off before you can put this thing together. All right, and then we have our bechamel sauce. We're going to preheat our oven to 350 while we're assembling our moussaka. Gonna want to coat the bottom of a, what are these, 9 by 13? So into the bottom of this roasting pan, I'm going to put about a 1/2 cup of breadcrumbs. My 1/2 cup measuring cup is in the dishwasher, so I'm using a 2/3 measuring cup and just eyeballing it. And this is our roasted eggplant. I actually roasted it several days ago because, as I mentioned, eggplant does not keep well, and it would keep roasted in their fridge much better than it would keep sitting raw on the counter. And so I just went ahead and roasted it ahead of time. And I have done this where in a pinch I have not had enough eggplant and I've just used sliced zucchini as an addition, and that actually works surprisingly well. And so if you don't happen to have enough eggplant, try throwing some zucchini in there. You know, never hurts to have another use for zucchini. So I'm gonna fish out my cinnamon stick and my bay leaf, and I'm going to use about half of this on the first layer. You guys, this really is good. It's fiddly. It's like making lasagna. It takes, you know, it's a lot of pans and a lot of dishes, but it is so worth it. And as I said, it does freeze beautifully. All right, so there's about half of our meat sauce. I'm gonna do another layer of eggplant. And it actually only calls for 2 layers of eggplant, so. Wow, that is a seedy chunk. I'm just gonna take that out of there. So we'll just strategically add the rest of these in here. All right, the second half of our meat sauce. And normally I would just pick this pan up, but this cast iron skillet weighs a ton and I can't easily hold it with one hand, so I'm just gonna scoop. Thankfully the meat has nicely cooled down. Do what you can to kind of evenly distribute that. All right. And now we are going to quite literally smother this in our custard. Make sure we've got all of our skin and lumps out of there. You want to make sure everything is covered. Brilliant. All right, we're gonna top this with 3 tablespoons. It calls for Pecorino Romano. This is just domestic Parmesan. which will work just fine. And I'm just eyeballing this. I'm not actually measuring it. I think I'm probably putting a little more than 3 tablespoons on. All right. This goes in the oven uncovered until the custard is set for about an hour at 350. All right, you guys, it's been an hour. Let's see how we're doing here. Oh, look at that. Beautiful. That looks amazing. I think we're there. That custard, see how it's basically like a baked egg dish. So our custard is pretty well set. And we've got a little bit of browning kind of around the edges and starting to brown on top. That's perfect. So there you go, moussaka, and we will let that cool a whole bunch and then we'll cut it and see how it is.